Hi, I'm Brian Russell. I'm the author of Centering Prayer. Sitting quietly in God's presence can change your life. And I want to talk about centering prayer and its relationship to the healing of trauma. Thomas Keating talks about divine therapy in his work, and you can also find that phrase in the work of Centering Prayer author Cynthia Bourgeault. I'll put both of those in the show notes. But there's a work that God can do in the silence that brings deep healing into our lives. Before I say a little bit more about that, I want to talk about trauma itself. Trauma is a word that we hear a lot about in 2023. And my favorite definition of trauma comes from a medical doctor named Gabor Mate. And he talks about trauma in these terms, and listen carefully to the distinctions that Mate makes. I find them really helpful. He says, trauma isn't what happened to us. Trauma is what happened and continues to happen inside of us because of what happened to us. So notice the distinction. The trauma itself isn't the thing that happened. It's the thing that happens inside of us because of what happened. And Mate says it's important to see that because there's good news there. Because if it's the thing that happened to us that is the trauma, then guess what? There's nothing we can ever do about it because we can't make it not have happened. But if trauma is our response to what happened on the inside, then we can turn the volume down on the pain, if not be substantially healed. Now, as a Christian, I see this ultimate healing is through the grace and power of God, right? And by the way, by saying that, I'm not even for a second minimizing the role that therapists could play. I've gone through real therapy to deal with some of my little t traumas. I'll talk about that again in a couple of minutes here. So we're not saying that only God can heal trauma, but what I am suggesting that the source of healing can be the deep spiritual work of God's grace, and that's where centering prayer can be helpful. Now, let me make another distinction about trauma. There's big T trauma and there's little t trauma. Both create soul wounds that need God's grace, okay? Big T trauma, when we say trauma with a capital T, you might say, that's obvious things like having been sexually abused, physically abused, gone through some kind of catastrophe, whether it's a natural disaster or a war, been in a major accident, the things that you would assume are big traumas, including also having gone through a really difficult divorce, especially if you were young and your parents divorced, and especially it was a particularly acrimonious one, though just the fact of your parents separating, that's a trauma, okay? Then there's little t trauma. So if big T traumas are things that were done to you that shouldn't have been done, or things that happened that shouldn't have happened, little t traumas are things that should have happened but didn't. And this is where the issues of things like neglect came up. Maybe your emotional needs weren't met, even though your parents tried and did their best. Those are what we would call little t traumas. So what role does centering prayer play in all this? And where does this idea of divine therapy that Thomas Keating and other centering prayer authors like Cynthia Bourgeault, Marika O'Madigan, he has one of my favorite books, Centering Prayer and the Healing of the Unconscious. What are they talking about? Well, it's this. In silence, when we open ourselves up into the silence and sit with God quietly, what happens slowly over time is what's unconscious. And a lot of the trauma that we've experienced has been buried really deep. Maybe it comes out in some way we act. We talk about things that are triggers, right? So trauma is like this pain spot inside of us. It's that soul wound. And if the wrong thing touches it, it hurts. And so a lot of times our traumas are acted out in ways that create problems for us in social interactions with others and even just in our happiness going through life. And so what does centering prayer do with all that? Well, what I've noticed and I've experienced and these writers write about is that sitting in silence over time, our unconscious becomes conscious. And then with our prayer word, we literally are able to give those hurt parts of ourselves and just hand them to God. Now, I'm not talking about quick fixes on this, but you'll have moments of real deep healing when you really just feel some of the trauma just release out of your body. Again, this doesn't replace the use of really excellent therapists. This doesn't take the place of doing things like affirmations, attending worship services, being around friends, building deep relationships. But centering prayer by itself as a practice is a tool that God can use that allows us to consciously open ourselves up and let God get into those hurt parts. And when God's grace begins to touch those places, and we experience the love of God even in these hurt, scared, wounded parts, you can experience real healing in this life. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me directly, deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. And if you're interested in any of the resources, I'll put some of the books by some of these folks that I mentioned in the show notes. But thank you for listening all the way to the end. And if I can be of any service, reach out.